Everyone thought my grandfather was a good man, calm, reliable. My parents are dead. My grandmother is in intensive care because of him, not because he hit her, but because he destroyed her quietly, and no one noticed until it was almost too late. I used to think my family was small because it was quiet. After my parents died, silence became our currency. We spent it carefully. My grandparents' house was the only place that didn't ask questions I couldn't answer. It smelled like detergent and overcooked soup. Everything had its place. Shoes by the door, cups aligned, days repeating without surprises. I was too much there, too loud when I laughed, too restless when I moved from room to room. I carried color into a house that preferred beige, but no one told me to stop, not directly. My grandmother spoke softly, as if the walls were listening. My grandfather filled space without raising his voice. He was calm in a way that felt earned, respected, the kind of man people trusted instinctively. Order followed him like a shadow. After my parents, I learned to watch instead of ask, to read rooms the way others read faces. That's how you survive loss without becoming invisible. At the time, I didn't know anything was wrong. I only knew that the house felt quieter than usual, and that quiet had started to press back. The first thing that changed wasn't a secret, it was a rhythm. My grandfather began coming home a little later, never late enough to explain. His coat still hung in the same place. His keys still landed in the bowl by the door. Nothing was missing, just slightly delayed. He spoke the same way, asked the same questions, corrected the same details. Order remained intact. That was the trick. I noticed how my grandmother adjusted without comment. Dinner waited longer. Tea went cold. She stopped reminding him of things he used to remember on his own. It looked like patience, but patience has a posture. This felt more like retreat. At the same time, a name started repeating in my other life. At school, in syllabi, in passing remarks from classmates. A woman everyone respected, composed, efficient, always on time. I didn't connect it to home at first. I just registered the coincidence and moved on. Loss teaches you to catalog details, so I cataloged them. A phone turned face down, a smile that arrived half a second too late, silence where correction used to live. Nothing dramatic happened, but the air learned a new weight, and it stayed. I didn't find out. There was no moment I could point to later and say this is where everything broke. It was more like watching a picture sharpen slowly, pixel by pixel, until denying it required effort. My grandfather didn't hide anything. He didn't need to. His confidence had weight. He moved through the house like someone who believed he was still untouchable. My grandmother noticed before I did. I saw it in how she folded laundry more carefully, as if precision could replace certainty. In how she stopped asking questions that used to have answers. I connected the dots last. Not because I was naive, but because this was the last structure I had left. Parents gone, family reduced to two aging silhouettes and me. Accepting the truth felt like volunteering to lose again. The woman from my classes began to feel closer than coincidence. Same phrases, same hours, same calm efficiency I recognized at home. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. What settled in instead was something colder and more useful, understanding. And once it arrived, it didn't leave. My grandmother never said his name differently, but her body did. She moved slower, as if each step required permission. Meals became smaller without explanation. She started forgetting things that mattered to her, not keys or appointments, but stories. She would stop mid-sentence and wave it away, like it wasn't important anymore. At night, I heard her awake, not crying, just breathing wrong. My grandfather noticed, of course. He always noticed everything. He brought flowers once, too formal, too late. They sat on the table untouched until the water turned cloudy. That was when I understood something essential. Betrayal doesn't need to be loud to be fatal. It just needs to be consistent. Stress isn't a storm, it's erosion. By the time the ambulance came, there was no scene, no shouting, just efficiency, white light, paperwork, a doctor explaining precaution and monitoring. In the waiting room, my grandfather held his posture perfectly. People like him always do. I watched him perform concern with the same precision he used for everything else, and something inside me locked into place. Whatever I had been before that moment, I wasn't it anymore. The hospital had its own version of silence. Not quiet, but controlled noise. Machines breathing for people who couldn't afford mistakes. My grandmother lay still in a bed that looked too big for her, wires tracing paths across her skin like she was being slowly rewritten. They called it stress, as if stress were a visitor, not something invited and fed daily. I stood there and realized how easy it is to hurt someone without touching them. My grandfather visited at the right hours, spoke to the doctors politely, updated relatives with measured concern. He never once sat down, as if staying upright proved something. I didn't accuse him. I didn't need to. The truth had already settled between us, heavy and unmoving. Watching him there, I understood what he valued most. Not love, not even forgiveness, stability, reputation, the image of being the kind of man this didn't happen to. That was the moment the shape of my response became clear. If I ever acted, it wouldn't be emotional. It would be precise. You don't fight people like him with noise. You use the one thing they can't survive losing, the version of themselves everyone else believes in. After that, I stopped reacting and started preparing. Not in a dramatic way. There were no lists taped to walls, no late-night vows whispered into mirrors. Just attention, sharpened. I listened when relatives spoke around him, the casual admiration, the assumptions built on decades of consistency. I noticed how often his name ended conversations, how it closed arguments without effort. Authority like that doesn't come from fear. It comes from trust left unquestioned for too long. I let him believe nothing had changed. I answered politely. I nodded at the right moments. I even helped him with small things, the way I always had. That was important. People remember continuity. Meanwhile, I collected what already existed. Dates that didn't align, explanations that required generosity to accept, a pattern that only looked harmless when viewed in isolation. I didn't invent anything. I didn't exaggerate. I just made sure it could all be seen at once. By the time my grandmother stabilized, I was no longer waiting for justice. I was designing context. And context, when revealed publicly, does more damage than accusation ever could. I chose the moment carefully. Not a confrontation, not a trap, an occasion. Family gathered the way it always did, under the pretense of normalcy. Plates passed, glasses filled, stories recycled. My grandfather was at the center, relaxed, confident, the role fitting him like it always had. That mattered. Context is only powerful when it feels safe. I didn't interrupt. I waited until the room settled into its familiar rhythm, until everyone was listening without realizing it. Then I spoke the way he taught me to speak, calmly, fact first, without emphasis. Dates, places, overlaps. I framed it as clarification, not accusation. Questions that answered themselves. I watched faces shift as the pieces aligned. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. My grandfather didn't deny it. He couldn't. Not without dismantling the image he'd spent years protecting. Silence did the rest. In that pause, reputation collapsed under its own weight. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was exact. And when the room finally exhaled, I understood something simple and final. Truth doesn't need volume when it has witnesses. No one defended him. That surprised me less than it should have. People don't like being the last ones to realize something obvious. They looked at the table instead, at their hands, at anything that allowed them to process without choosing sides. My grandfather finally spoke, but it wasn't a denial. It was an explanation shaped like dignity, careful words, context trimmed to comfort. He was still trying to control the narrative, even as it slipped away. I let him finish. Interrupting would have cheapened everything. When I added my last sentence, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even look at him. I spoke about my grandmother, about the hospital, about stress that accumulates quietly when you pretend not to see what hurts you. That was the point where the room changed, because betrayal is abstract until it has consequences. After that, people stopped nodding. Someone stood up. Someone else asked him to leave. Order didn't shatter. It reorganized without him at the center. Watching that happen felt strangely calm, not like victory, more like alignment, as if something that had been crooked for years finally straightened itself without resistance. After that evening, the house felt different, but not empty. It was quieter in a cleaner way, like a room after furniture has been moved out and dust finally settles. My grandfather didn't argue his exile. He understood consequences when they arrived, dressed as consensus. Relatives called less often, then stopped mentioning him altogether. Reputation doesn't disappear in a moment. It erodes, the same way my grandmother had. I visited her every day while she recovered, sitting beside the bed, describing ordinary things, restoring a sense of sequence. She never asked what I had done. She didn't need to. Sometimes she squeezed my hand, not in gratitude, but in recognition. That mattered more. I realized then that revenge wasn't about punishment. It was about correction, about returning reality to its proper shape. My grandfather lost the role that protected him, and without it, he was just a man with explanations no one needed anymore. I didn't feel lighter. I felt steadier, as if something inside me had finally stopped compensating for someone else's lies. People asked me later if I felt relief. I didn't know how to answer that without simplifying something that took years to form. What I felt was scale. My life expanded back to its original size, no longer adjusted around someone else's silence. I stopped editing myself for harmony that only ever protected one person. My grandmother came home weaker but clearer, as if the truth had given her a boundary she'd been missing. We rebuilt routines slowly, tea at the same hour, windows opened even when it was cold. The house learned new habits. My grandfather existed somewhere outside our days, reduced to a footnote no one needed to reference. I didn't celebrate that. I accepted it. Power doesn't always look like dominance. Sometimes it looks like not being asked to explain yourself anymore. I kept my voice. I kept my memory. I kept the right to be too much without apology. He thought replacement could happen quietly. He underestimated what happens when quiet people decide to speak precisely.